Hey everyone, welcome to Cerwin Vegas, and in this video, finally going to get the test run my Cerwin Vega 215P loudspeakers. This will be part 3 of the 215P series I've got on my channel. If you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, be sure to go check those out. Part 2 we did a refoam on them, and part 1 was just me opening them up, checking out what kind of drivers were used inside. I was unfamiliar with this model until I picked them up, and didn't know anything about them at the time. I've learned a little bit more now that I've had them in the shop for a while. I was able to get a little information on them. These are apparently rated at 200 watts a piece, and other than that, that's all I've been able to really find out. So after I got these refoamed, I was pretty excited and I'm pretty anxious to get these things hooked up and give them a listen. I was originally going to use my Adcom power amp on them. Seemed like a good match. That's a 200 watt at 8 ohm per channel amplifier. Seeing as how they had kind of a pro audio styling to them, and they do have a TS 1/4 inch input on the back of them, I really wanted to run a pro audio amp on them. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Before I hook these up, I am going to go through a few things. I'm going to go through some information on running pro amps on your home audio gear. Yes, you can do it. There's a lot of Cerwin Vega guys, they like to run pro audio amps on their stuff, and I get it. It's a really good bang for your buck way to get some big power to these speakers. A lot of them can handle it. Maybe some different cables that are going to be required to do so. So for this video, what I'm going to be using is this Behringer Europower EP1500 Pro Amp. It's advertising on the front of this unit that it will do 700 watts per channel. If you go through and look at the specs, that's your absolute max power output with a 2 ohm load on it. This is a pretty good power amp. This amplifier was running 2 18-inch bass bins and 2 15-inch monitors, and it did it with ease. So this is gonna be a little more than needed for these speakers. Like I mentioned, these 215Ps are rated at 200 watts. Like everything and every amp that I use and every speaker that I power, I always like to have that headroom. And that is the other nice thing about running these pro amps, is generally most of them are going to have a clip light. So these red lights here. So those are going to start flashing when you're running this thing, and it detects the amplifier's clipping. So you're going to be, at that point, you're at its maximum power output. So if you're thinking about purchasing a pro amp to run your Cerwin Vegas, there's information you got to know. Just like any other amplifier, you need to know all its power specs, how many watts it runs at what ohm, and you also need to know how many ohms your speakers are. Because I don't have any actual information on these speakers to what their rated impedance is, all I'm left with is hooking up my multimeter to find out the resistance. So first things first, grab your multimeter. We're just going to hook it up to these terminals in the front. Make sure you get a nice good connection, like so. And you want to turn it on. Now, hooked up to these front jacks, I'm getting 3.9 for 4 ohms. So that is a little higher than some of my other Cerwin Vegas. My VS 120s, I get anywhere from 3.2 to 3.4 ohms. And those speakers, they rate them at a 4 to 8 ohm impedance running. So it's going to vary as they're operating. So now that I know that these read at about 4 ohms, I've got a good idea of the wattage output that this amplifier is going to have to my speakers. With these Cerwin Vegas hooked up to this EP1500, I looked up the specs. This amp puts out about 450 watts, both channels driven, before clipping. So before we even see those red lights start to illuminate, these speakers are going to get around 400 watts each. Seeing that my multimeter read a little higher than most of my 4 ohm speakers do, it could be a little less. Either way, 400 watts is still double of what they're rated at. A lot of Cerwin Vegas will take double what they're rated at, and they handle it quite well. I know a lot of my other speakers have, so I expect these to be about the same. So now that we know power ratings, we know the impedance of the speakers, we know what kind of power they're going to be seeing during our tests. I am going to be fairly cautious. We'll see how they react. These are original cones. I know originally, because these are in rough shape, I wasn't going to be too worried about it, but if I ever have to recone these, they're just not going to be the same. These are some of the better woofers that Cerwin Vega had put into their products. As much information as I've been able to find, these are running Hepner cones, and they do have the black steel stamped basket for the woofers. So we're gonna go through how we're gonna go about hooking these guys up. So I'm gonna be using my Yamaha preamp. There's a CX630. I used to run this thing pretty much every day. This was my main preamp for a long time before I purchased my AdCom gear. It's a really good preamp. I've been pretty happy with it. It has been sitting for a while, so I had to bring it out of the basement and clean it up and tested everything, make sure it works before I film this video. So on the back of this Yamaha preamp, you'll notice we've got nothing but RCA inputs and outputs. So that is going to pose to a bit of a problem, because the Pro amp that we have does not have those same RCA jack style connections, but it does not mean we cannot use this in this setup. So looking at the back of this Pro amp, we have our XLR inputs, the 1/4 inch TS outputs, cooling fan, which most Pro amps have. When it comes to your speaker outputs, you've got your standard banana plug style speaker outputs that most home audio receivers and amplifiers, integrated amps, whatever, they all have usually the same style, where you can unscrew them and then stick your wire in there and tighten down if you're just using a speaker wire with just bare wire connection. And they also have the option, if you want to run your banana plug style speaker connections like so. If you're running this Pro amp at home, this is not a problem. Pretty straightforward. You'll know how to hook these up. So hooking the amp to the speakers is not going to be the issue. The issue for you is going to be going from RCA into one of these style inputs. So there's a couple different ways we can go. I'm going to bring you over to the workbench and we'll go through some of the cables that I have and what we're going to be using, or what you can use to get the signal from your preamp to your power amp. So here I got a few different cables that you can use to hook up your preamp to your Pro amp. If your Pro amp does not have your RCA inputs on it, a cable like this, generally used in most car and home audio, you're not going to be able to use this. But what you can do is use something like this. If your amp has an XLR input on it, like most Pro amps do, you can use this cable here, because this will go from your RCA jacks to your XLR. So this would plug into the back of your preamp and this would go to your power amp. And that just converts that signal over. That's one option. The other option is pretty much same cable, same RCA connections that go into your preamp on that end. And the other end has got your TS 1/4 inch connections. So these are going to be, each connection here is mono. So you do need both of them, as this wire is together, for your left and right channels. Now, when I first got these speakers and seeing that I knew it had that 1/4 inch input in the back of it, I went on Amazon and just bought a cheap cable. It came with a little link. I don't know how long this is. I don't know, 10 feet maybe. But this has your TS connection on the one end and then just your bare wire on the other. So my plan initially was to run this end into my AdCom power amp and then use this to plug into the back of the speaker, just so I didn't have to look at the speaker wire in the front and use those bare wire connections that those 215Ps have in the front. But what I'm going to be using today, this is another option you have. This is your speak-on connection. So now this is going to plug into the back of my power amp, It goes in, turns, and locks. It's a really nice connection. And then on the other end is your mono TS 1/4 inch connector. So this is going to be what goes into the back of my speaker, and this will go into the power amp. So that's what I'm going to be using today, even though I could just use this guy here, because that Pro amp does have the speaker terminals. You could use this. This is just a little nicer cable. Okay, let's get hooking this thing up. First things first, I'm going to be running my RCA to headphone jack cable into the back of my preamp, which is going to run to my tablet. I'm going to use the CD input on this guy. So just like so. Now I'm going to use my RCA to XLR cable. So this is simply just going to plug into your pre-out of the preamp section, like so. And then you want to go to your input on your Pro amp. So I could use my other cable too, because this amp does have your 1/4 inch TS input as well as the XLR. Just like so. So now we've got the preamp hooked up to the power amp, and we've got my signal cable that's going to be coming from my tablet hooked up to the preamp. So all that's left is now your speaker output, because I've got the TS connections in the back of my speakers. So I'm going to be using my 1/4 inch TS end is going to go into the back of my speakers, and the speak on connection is going to go into the back of the Pro amp. So these are pretty straightforward. You can see there's the little tabs on them. You want to line those up and then turn, and you'll hear it lock. Just like so. And then this into the back of my loudspeaker. Now we'll do the other one. That. And like so. So just like that, we're hooked up, ready to go fire these things up.